Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question for you. Are you concerned that the world's economy is more fragile than anyone is admitting? Let's get to the bottom line. You can always find doomsday predictions telling you that the dollar is on the verge of collapse or that the global financial system is in serious danger, but how much of it is true? Let's look at this clock. This is a live shot of the U.S. national debt clock in New York. It's not 100% accurate, but it gives you a good estimate of the American national deficit right now. Earlier this year, it pushed well beyond $20 trillion. It's $22 trillion now. But what does that mean for the United States and for the world? Is the sky about to fall? What do we really need to be worried about? And what trend should we be paying attention to? Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have all the answers to these questions. Sandra Navidi is CEO of the global consultancy firm Beyond Global, and she's author of Superhubs, How the Financial Elite and Their Networks Rule Our World. Edward Luce is the chief U.S. commentator for the Financial Times, and Doug Redeker, who has represented the U.S. on the executive board of the International Monetary Fund, is also a top leader at the World Economic Forum in Davos. It's so great to be with all of you here today. Thanks for joining me. And let me just start out. We're looking at the national debt clock. Is that something that we should care about, or is it just a number?
Sure. In principle, you should always care about the level the national debt is at, because it's a measure of what you can afford in the future, as well as today. I'd say, though, that the absolute number, 22 trillion, whatever it might be, isn't as important as the share of GDP. And it's still considerably below 100% of GDP in the United States, particularly if you only include publicly held debt. That is, debt as bond markets call debt, not debt as implied by what we owe Social Security in the future, in the next 20, 30 years, whatever that gap might be. And it's actually not that high. And so numbers like 22 trillion, they're just numbers. What matters is ratios. And the ratio compared to, say, China, compared to a lot of Europe, and compared to parts of the United States history, particularly after the Second World War, is not that high. What matters is, will growth exceed interest payments?
So what I'm hearing you say is it's really a number. When Obama came into office, that clock was around $10 trillion. Now it's about $20 trillion when Trump came in. It's $2 trillion higher now. And you're saying that what we really need to worry about is the debt to GDP ratio, which I think the United States is about 90%. There are different numbers depending on how you count. Doug, do you know what the right number is virtually?
It's somewhere around 90. There are different ways to calculate it. Let's call it 90 plus. By the way, I disagree with that.
So give me, just before you do this, give us some other numbers. Like, what is Japan at? I mean, Japan has got to be staggering.
So Japan is well north of 200% of debt to GDP, and Japan is always considered an outlier. Whenever you have those great graphs and bar charts, there's always the question, do you include Japan or do you do that little squiggly thing? Because if you include Japan, it's such an outlier that everybody else is down here and Japan is up there. But Japan is a very different economic model because it's a different social model. It's a different political model. Japan is homogeneous. Japan has outlasted every economic bear assumption for years, on the assumption that someday the Japanese will pull together and, as a homogenous culture, they will bear any costs of an absurd amount of debt to GDP. But let me go back, if I may, to Ed's point. So I am more worried because I think it's not a number that bothers me. You're right, 22 trillion, 23 trillion. I mean, it's an absurd number.
So what's the number that does bother you?
So what bothers me is the deficit more than the debt. Because the deficit, which is roughly $1 trillion a year in good times in the U.S. right now, under the Trump administration, means that people are getting used to things that we are borrowing to pay for, right? So it's not just the sum total of the outstanding debt stock. It's the fact that on an ongoing basis, we are now building up obligations to our people and to other government functions that need to be paid for on a rolling basis. So it's not that under the Obama administration, as a means by which to respond to the financial crisis, we had a stimulus, which then rolled off as the economy picked up and the crisis became something that we'd taken care of.
Well, let me just make your point for you in a way. And in 2016, the national deficit was $585 billion, and that has grown steadily every year. And now in 2019, it's $1 trillion, $1 trillion. And as you said, it's likely to continue to grow. And so put this in real terms. I mean, these are numbers right now. What are we not able to do what is the United States not able to do because of this deficit that's building and creating future obligations?
So I wouldn't look at it that way, because we're able to do anything we want right now if we just consider that borrowing is a costless exercise.
Right.
What's happened in the world over the past, let's call it the past decades, but certainly in the past decade and certainly in the past recent few years, is no longer do countries borrow on the expectation that they will repay. They borrow on the expectation that they will refinance. And in a zero or low or negative interest rate environment, that's a costless exercise. You just borrow because you're actually getting paid. In Germany's case, you're getting paid for the privilege of borrowing. So that's a great thing. But that's not necessarily going to last forever. In fact, I would argue it's impossible to believe it's going to last forever. So at some point, these low, absurdly low, and negative interest rate borrowing costs are going to turn around. And since you're not borrowing on the basis of an ability to repay, you're borrowing on the basis of an ability to refinance. When those refinancing costs go up, where's the money coming from?
Just to get, I know you're going to bring Sandra in, but very quick point. I'm not sure you're disagreeing with me. We're talking about whether the debt is being used well or not. And I'd agree entirely with Doug that these deficits that we've seen generated in the last 2-3 years under Trump have been wasted on the corporate sector that was already highly profitable, that was already, by historic rates, buying back its shares with dividends. So there was no
So if they were investing in productive capacity or things that added, to the economy, that would be a different thing. But basically shelving it as stock buyback, shelving it other ways, are things that are unproductive, that do not add to the economy.
Stuff that Trump promised during the election campaign, training, infrastructure, all the stuff he hasn't done since he was elected. If the deficit was being used to raise future growth rates, then I would have and I suspect Doug and probably Sandra would have a different view of whether these are worth it.
Sandra, you've written about super hubs, the financial elites, and as I understand it, really the way this is a stacked deck, if you will, the global economy in certain ways. And so I'd be interested in your perspective on what Doug just shared and Ed. But Doug just zeroed in that this is, in a way, a stacked deck and that the numbers do matter. But you've written that these folks are doing it purposely.
Well, let me differentiate. I think after the financial crisis of 2008, the debt that was taken on was a bug, not a feature. I think since President Trump has taken over, it's become a feature, not a bug. And I would say that debt is one risk in interaction with growth. But also, risks have the nasty habit of interacting with each other and exacerbating each other. So I think another risk that is very dangerous when it comes together with debt is the global trade war, because that will weigh on growth and potential long-term deglobalization, because we see protectionism all over the world. So I think when you take all these risks together and the fact that since 2008, the world has become more interconnected, technical progress has been exponential, I just think that we cannot, it's impossible to say what the black swan will be, i.e. when a crisis will happen and what will trigger it. But that the whole system as such has become more fragile is a fact.
So Doug, how do you look at both risks and then the status of the dollar and the status of the U.S. economy, the predominant position that America has in the world today? Are you still worried at all about that, or do you think that actually we're overhyping that fragility?
So I would divide it into two things: the dollar and the financial market supremacy,
right,
the New York Stock Exchange, SEC, that sort of listing thing. On the dollar itself, what I guess none of us anticipated was that you were going to have this bullying approach by the U.S. president that effectively, because remember, dollar values, as any currency values, have to be valued against something else. So if you are tamping down the economic potential and activity of another country, then by definition, their currency is probably going to be weaker vis-a-vis the dollar. So the U.S. is a very resilient economy and has performed very well in spite of... Well,
because of bullying?
No. The U.S. economy has done well because it has intrinsic benefits, and because, as we just talked about, you've got these deficits that we've taken on to stimulate when stimulus might not have even been necessary. But we're doing well. The U.S. economy is doing well. But because of the trade wars, because of the abuse, I would argue, of sanctions and tariffs, and other means, you're actually seeing a tamping down of confidence in other countries and other major currencies. So the dollar continues to appreciate, which is exactly what, of course, Donald Trump doesn't want to see and why he's been jawboning Jay Powell to try and reduce U.S. interest rates. That's a separate issue. The dollar so far has been stronger than the president would like. It has been very resilient. I would argue it is going to continue to be resilient. However, it is resilient in spite of the fact that most of the rest of the world views dollar supremacy no longer as necessarily a good thing or even something that they are willing to tolerate for the greater global good. They actually view it as there is no alternative. There is an effort now on multiple levels to see if they can find an alternative. But for a variety of reasons, it's very difficult to see that there is going to be an alternative.
Why can't the Chinese renminbi eventually be an alternative?
Well, eventually is a long time. But let's say in the foreseeable future, the problem with the renminbi is the renminbi is a managed currency. So nobody believes that the Chinese economy, much less the Chinese currency, is actually set by the markets. So if you're going to be using it as a reserve currency or as a currency for your transactions and trade, you want to know that the value is either going to be retained, so stable because it's fully, fairly valued, or because you can anticipate what's going to happen on basically market-driven mechanisms. In the Chinese case, it is not implicitly, it is explicitly a tool of the Chinese government. And so therefore, the renminbi as an attractive alternative to the dollar still has a long way to go.
Sandra, does this, I'm going to poke this for a minute and would love your view. If Donald Trump is pounding on the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Jay Powell, as Doug just shared, on the level of interest rates, doesn't that reduce the sense of independence of the U.S. dollar and what's going to? Don't you have a kind of China mimicry where the central government is pounding on economic authorities to get economic results? Or is there any risk in Donald Trump's behavior?
Well, yes, of course. He wants to be an autocrat, and so he behaves like an autocrat, and including those that he criticizes. But I think the effect will still be that the dollar will remain strong only because it's the best house in the neighborhood. But I think part of the exorbitant privilege, the fact that the U.S. can print dollars, is also it's still considered a safe haven despite Trump because of the institutions which, while he has tried to undermine them and he has arguably weakened checks and balances, it's still, compared to other countries, relatively secure.
Ed, I love this analogy, best house in the neighborhood. Where is Sandra wrong that this is the best house in the neighborhood, or is just every other house just really sucks so bad that...
I think what Sandra and Doug, to rephrase what they're both saying, is that the dollar is the tallest dwarf. You know,
the tallest dwarf.
It's the tallest dwarf. But to go back to the house analogy, best house in the neighborhood, as a former American economic public official once said, it's not the wolf at the door, it's the termites in the foundation.
Right. So what are the termites today?
The termites in the foundation are political. America is becoming increasingly ungovernable. We have a president, as Doug was just discussing, who is attacking one of the most secure institutions in the federal system, namely the U.S. Federal Reserve. We have a separation of powers that isn't delivering political decision-making. But most importantly of all, we have a budgetary situation that is increasingly, if you look at the share of federal budget expenditures going on yesterday and not tomorrow. And tomorrow means training, young people, education, infrastructure, opportunities and environments in which new businesses are created, particularly, you know, when demography is increasingly aging. But what the budget is increasingly going on is Social Security, Medicare, interest payments on debt, on yesterday, in other words. And those are the termites in the foundation. There's no one particular moment where you realize it's not a sort of flash crisis. It's a gradual thing to which we get acclimatized.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I think, why wouldn't there be a flash crisis? As I've looked at markets in the past, or the change in political power historically, something comes to mind is Great Britain in the 1950s and the Suez Crisis, where with a single crisis, it became a punctuation point that the world realized your home country was no longer able to be the guarantor.
Eisenhower withdrew support from the pound.
Right, Eisenhower withdrew that, but it was Britain's dependence. And so it raises the question with termites in the framework, are we not paying enough attention to the fact that tomorrow we may look at a very different American situation with regard to the rest of the world.
So Ernest Hemingway once famously, or one of his characters once famously said, "How did you go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly." So they're not mutually exclusive. The termites in the foundation eventually cause it to collapse if it goes on like that. What could cause that? A crisis in the Gulf where America basically, because the people don't want to risk troops and spend more money, where China takes over, basically being the guarantor of global oil supplies. I suppose that could be an aha moment. It could be dramatic reform to make China's currency open and liquid and deepen its capital markets. That I find is less probable. Any number of black swan events could cause this foundation to collapse. But for the time being, we're talking about, as I said earlier, the tallest dwarf. The dollar is the least bad option available in a world like this.
How do you see this? I think in the sense that whether we get a return of President Trump in the United States, or you get Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, any number of other of the candidates as well, do you think that could have ramifications to push reset on the way the dollar is looked at in the world?
So I would say that it's not just the dollar. I think the big issue, and it's akin to what you're describing, is about the U.S. engagement and the multilateral world order that we and the Europeans created post-World War II, whether it's Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, or a wide range of the accepted institutions and norms that global trade, commerce, finance, economic...
So this is the OECD, the WTO...
Everything. The WTO, I mean, ironically, this week the WTO will cease to function as it was designed to function.
Explain that. Tell our audience why.
So the WTO has a dispute settlement board or body which is supposed to have 7 judges.
Called the appellate body.
The appellate body. It is supposed to have a minimum of 3, and as of December 10th, 2 of those judges' terms expire, and the U.S. has withheld support for renewing or extending those terms, so that as of midnight, December 10th, there will only be 1 empowered judge, which is below the quorum, which means that the dispute settlement mechanism cannot function. But again, that's arcane stuff. But what matters more, I think, than the WTO is this institutional framing of, do we believe in these multilateral institutions or not? And you were asking about what happens as a result of the 2020 elections here in the United States. I would say that you've got either a return to normal or you don't. And normal to me, well, let's say the don't is the re-election of Donald Trump, or, as you said, an Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, who are really seeking a revolution on a lot of different levels, not just military engagement and isolationism versus interventionism, just the U.S. role in the world. A Joe Biden-style presidency would be more continuity, go back to, quote, normal. And in a normal environment, then I think the U.S. dollar, the U.S. Preeminence in financial markets and economic prowess around the world is restored. It won't go back to the way it was, but it largely stays on a status quo before the Trump administration sought to challenge that multilateral system. If we are seeing a re-election of Donald Trump or something like a Warren presidency where she seeks to overtly change the paradigm, then you are looking at an increasing motivation of other countries to create new institutions, new mechanisms. I still don't see a challenge to the dollar, but I do see challenges to business as usual. Are we going to go back to normal? If we're not, then all bets are off.
Sandra, what Doug just described is something that I see going on globally, that the pressures about whether the system goes back to normal and pushes reset or changes. And if you look at the political dynamics in advanced industrial democracies, one after the other, the rise of populism is essentially a rejection of the social contract and the economic contract. So we're talking at a big macro level about the dollar and global influence and markets, but beneath that, in the way growth has been shared, has created incredible political tumult and change. And I'm interested in your insights, again, coming back to super hubs and the financial elites. Do they get the message that the equation is not working? That even if because they want to keep things back where they were, but are they willing to tweak it so that we get something between Doug's first option and second option?
Yes, so in my book, Super Hubs, I explain the financial system as a complex, self-organizing system that is based on network theory. I explain it with network theory. That sounds complicated, but it actually makes it easier to understand. And in this network, we're all nodes, and Super Hubs are the center of nodes. And I do think that the Super Hubs who've worked together very effectively after the financial crisis of 2008, where I said the redistribution from the 99% to the 1% was a bug, not the feature, and Donald Trump has turned it around to an extreme, and I think...
So it's now resilient, it's going to be with us.
Well, it's now increased exponentially, and Donald Trump knows that if there are checks and balances, he can't reign, he won't have absolute power. So that is the purpose why, surprisingly, effectively, he has undermined global institutions which are based on our common norms and values, and disrupting that disrupts stability and creates new risks. But I would like to draw attention to another fact, because we're focusing on the financial system. Well, we must not forget the fact that the U.S. is still so strong with regard to the financial system and the dollars of monopolism, due to globalization and technical progress. We are seeing this now in the tech world, and the tech world is increasingly more venturing over into the financial world. The guys are getting bigger and bigger. Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg, and all are getting more power. So I think it's a parallel danger.
Thank you. Ed, let me just ask you in our last couple of minutes, as you look at the dashboard of the global economy today, America's place in it, what are the parts of it that you think are most important to look at today?
I think we haven't talked enough about China and India, both of which are in a synchronized slowdown. China has provided more of the source of global demand for global growth since the 2008 crisis than the United States.
More than the U.S. consumer?
Yes. And China is now slowing. India is slowing very rapidly. So that there is a global synchronized slowdown going on, as the IMF calls it. But, we've got the sort of twin engines of the East slowing down quite rapidly.
So Larry Summers used to talk about the world economy flying on the back of the American consumer. Is that true again?
No, it's at the very least a twin engine, but actually it's more than twin, so it's getting more complex. But the whole world's slowing, but the part of the world that needs to be growing rapidly is slowing most markedly, and that's Asia.
Doug, what is your black swan that we should be thinking about?
Oh, I think technological decoupling. I think that there's a very real risk, accelerating every day, that you're going to end up in the very near future with a Chinese block, a U.S. block, and the Europeans caught in the middle, and everybody else caught in the middle without the heft the U.S. brings to the table. So the economy of the 21st century is going to be very much technologically driven. 5G is the start. And that infrastructure is clearly now going to be divided between...
And that can happen, and they can still use the dollar.
They can still use the dollar, but I would say my black swan is that you end up with not a central bank created currency as a threat to the U.S. dollar, but you end up with some form of a digital currency that does end up being...
So that's a cryptocurrency, a Bitcoin?
So, well, I wouldn't call it a Bitcoin, and I don't think anybody's come up with the right model yet, but in terms of your black swan scenario...
Maybe it's Facebook's Libra?
It's not going to be that either. But there are a lot of impediments to it, but given the suspicions of central bank created reserve currencies, the idea of this technological bifurcation in the currency realm is not something that I would take.
Sandra, 30 seconds on your black swan.
Well, there's an embarrassment of riches. Since Doug just took my answer, I would say cyber risk. And the greatest risk actually that I'm seeing is inequality, which is increasing exponentially. 2015, 80 people had as much wealth as 3.6 billion people in the world, and now just...
That's 80 people versus 3.6 billion people.
Yes, in 2019, that has decreased on the part of the billionaires to 26, from 80 to 26, now have as much as 3.8 billion people. So this is set to further increase, also due to technological, the tech giants. So it's getting worse and worse and less stable.
I love spending time with you, but it's kind of depressing in some way. Things are not all well in the economic house. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Doug Redeker, Senior Fellow in Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution, Edward Luce, Chief U.S. Commentator for the Financial Times, and Sandra Navidi, CEO of Beyond Global in New York. Thank you all so much for being with me today. Before we get to the bottom line, let's go back to New York. There's the U.S. national debt clock that we saw at the beginning of the show. Notice any difference? It's not precise, but more than $78 million in debt was added in half an hour. And for now, none of that makes a difference, according to our experts. So what does matter? Government debt that cripples new investment? Trade wars that slow growth? Inequality, where just a few dozen billionaires hold more wealth than 3.5 billion people. And tech companies that today are more powerful than governments. Fear is replacing trust in the world, and that may cause future earthquakes, shaking up the global economy, creating a less mighty dollar, and changing America's place in the world. And that's the bottom line.